Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Nick Weber, one of the board members for the Citizen Oversight Board. Welcome to our August 25th, 2023 meeting. Just a few agenda items. I think we have a quorum here, so we can get started. Welcome to any members of the public that are watching, and welcome Sheriff Diggins. Excited to get into some questions with you. Just some logistical things. Looks like, did everyone have a chance to review the meeting minutes from August 4th? And can we get a motion to approve if everyone had a chance to review?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, so we will approve the minutes from August 4th. Just some quick announcements before we turn things over to Sheriff Diggins. If anybody is watching from the public, you can submit questions in the Q&A function. I'll do my best to catch those. We also have our help, Nicole, from the OIM stepping in for Daniel today. So between her and I, we'll get it done and get those questions asked. We have City Council has officially opened applications for the last seat on the Citizen Oversight Board. On our website is information on how to apply if anybody is interested, anyone in the public. Also has links to some of those really great videos that we just got finished explaining why we all feel like oversight is super important and super essential for the community to be engaged with law enforcement. And then just a quick announcement for the next meeting. We usually do first and third Fridays, but we're switching that up because of the Labor Day weekend. So our next meeting is going to be September 15th with Police Chief Ron Thomas. So please keep that on your calendars so you can attend as well. I think that does it, unless I'm missing anything, Julia. So then we can turn things over to Sheriff Diggins. I'm happy to kind of move through it how you'd like, Sheriff. I know we sent some questions over to you earlier, so if you wanted to start at the top or however you'd like to move through those.
Nick, I think it'll be good to start at the top, and good morning to each of you, as well as to the community that's watching. In normal fashion, I will read the question, we'll respond, and then we'll pause for questions from the board, if that's okay with you all.
Mm-hmm.
All right, first question this morning is, what is the DSD's, Denver Sheriff's Department's current staffing level for both sworn and professional staff? For our uniform staff, we're currently at 64.96 operational strength. And when you adjust that to take out modified duty, other folks that may be on leave, our adjusted operational strength is 60.88%. Follow-up to that is when we spoke with Executive Director of Safety, Saul Dalte, in April, he mentioned that the DSD had moved its application testing from NTN to Workday. Has that increased the quantity of completed applications? Yes, it has. According to data received from Safety HR recruitment team, the change from the NTN assessment resulted in a 165% increase in eligible candidates. So we believe it has been successful. Have you seen a change in applicant quality? Thus far, we have no discernible change in applicant quality. DSD recruit class 2023-3 began this past Monday on August 23rd with 30 recruits. I was with them last night, and all 30 of them continue to stay in that class. So we're very happy about that. We will be analyzing their performance throughout the academy to determine if the impacts of the new assessment had any change, and if any changes need to be made to the new testing process. So I will pause there for any questions. All right, seeing none. Question number 2, has contact visitation begun at the county jail? It has not. The construction is almost complete. There's a public art piece that's going inside of the contact visit room that we are excited to have installed. It's going to fall in line with our philosophy of leading with humanity. we anticipate that contact visits will launch in the fall of 2020. I'll pause there for any questions. Julia.
It's kind of fall of 2023. So what does that mean? Like October, November? Or does that mean in a couple of weeks? What does that feel like to you?
It feels closer to October, November. And I would say that we're excited to reintroduce contact visits into the visit options that we have for the people that are in custody, as well as their families.
Thanks. And just a follow-up question. Compared to other kinds of visitors, do you expect this to be, you know, more used, more selectively used, you know, sort of what can we understand in terms of, you know, the use of this new space?
Jails across America that are going back to contact visits, which we're in a very small pool in that regard, are doing the same thing that we're going to do, which is to offer them to a very small portion of the folks that are in our custody. Perhaps at some point that could grow, but we want to start off incrementally with offering it as a smaller option versus the more robust video visitation system that we currently have.
And can you just say, like, what are the criteria for the folks that you're going to offer it to?
It's mostly folks that have demonstrated that their behavior has been above par. And for folks that have lower level charges and they're going back to the community sooner rather than later, we believe that those visits are going to be very beneficial to them as well.
So sorry, just to follow up on that, Sheriff Diggins, is there going to be sort of a component, if I understand you correctly, that's understanding like you said, above par, maybe like trustee status or something like that? But then also it seems like maybe there's a timing thing as well, like you're getting released in the next month. So, or how are you imagining that playing out?
Yeah, generally it's those folks who are coming back to the community versus the folks that may be going to the Colorado Department of Corrections on higher level charges and perhaps whose behavior has not been acceptable in while they have been in our custody. So we want to gauge that, and based on the request that we have, along with assessing the person's behavior while they have been in custody, figure out whether or not that person would be someone who that very small pool of the population that we have would be eligible to have those visits. So it's absolutely a privilege to have a contact visit, an in-person visit with the people that are in our custody.
So Sheriff, so who is going to make that decision in terms of, because some of that is very subjective in terms of, you know, behavior that's above par. Who's responsible for making that decision? And then secondly, with respect to people who are transitioning to the community, is that anybody in your custody who's going to be going back to the community as opposed to the Department of Corrections? That entire segment of the population would be eligible, assuming that their conduct is at a certain level?
Yeah, it would be the folks generally that are coming back to the community that would be receiving those visits. There may be some folks that are going to the Colorado Department of Corrections whose behavior has been above par. That generally speaking, it would be those folks that are coming back to the community. The folks that are going to be doing that assessment are the leaders in our agency. Captain or a major will be making the decision on who's going to be getting those visits. So it'll be a very comprehensive process for us to make sure that we're doing that in a way that's fair and equitable across the board to the people that are in our custody.
Do inmates make a request to be considered? Is that how the process will work?
They will.
Any other questions on that one, or we can keep moving? Okay.
All right.
That's any other questions?
Thank you, Nick. Question number 3. We understand that there have been delays in getting all DSD deputies trained and required to use body-worn cameras. Why is that the case? I've been here for 29 years, and I can tell you that with all technology implementations, There have been things that have worked well when we implement them, and some things that we need to improve upon. The vast majority of Denver deputies have become compliant with the operation of their body worn cameras. And for those who are not, we're working towards compliance. We're also working actively with the city attorney's office to complete our training to ensure everyone understands exactly what they need to do in relation to operation of their body worn camera, along with uploading the information and downloading that information. So we believe that this is a work in progress, but we're headed in the right direction with making sure that this tool, which in my personal opinion is the best tool that law enforcement has seen in decades, is done right by the Denver Sheriff's Department. We all want this done right, and we're working towards that.
On that topic, Sheriff, I guess, and I don't know if you can speak to this, but what are some of the reasons that maybe some of the deputy sheriffs are giving when, there's a follow-up being like, hey, you're not in compliance, or you didn't do the body worn how you were supposed to? What are some of the concerns or pushback, if there is any, that you're hearing from your staff?
Generally speaking, it's sometimes forgetting to turn the body worn camera on when they're responding to an incident, or turning the body camera off after one incident and then another one starts right after that, or not being able to download the information the way that they're required to per our policy. So there are a number of reasons that have been given, but again, we're working through those things. Here's the other thing about body worn cameras. In an environment in a jail, Denver is in the minority for deployment. In fact, the Colorado revised statute that requires body worn cameras has an exception for jails. We, as a department, believe that they are beneficial to our staff and took the proactive step of adding them into one of the tools that is being utilized by our deputies. And so the frequency that a deputy who's working in a jail has in activating their body camera is probably higher than a deputy that's working on the street, or a police officer that's working on the street. So we're working through how do we ensure that with the frequency of the use of those body cameras, we're becoming compliant with that. And we believe that we're going in the right direction. Stefan, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Sheriff. What type of training would the city attorney's office be providing to the sheriffs, as opposed to, it seems to me, I mean, look, yeah, there are requirements and the like, but those are pretty straightforward in terms of what you're trying to implement, keep your body worn camera on, for during certain incidents, etc. But what sort of training would the city attorney's office be providing, as opposed to getting training about how to operate the cameras, which would seem to be outside the purview of the city attorney's office?
Well, let me clarify, Stefan. We are working with the city attorney's office to conduct that training. The city attorney is talking about the legal requirements that we have as a department in activation of the body cameras. We also have a uniformed captain who is conducting that training as well. So we're partnering with the city attorney's office to conduct that training. They're not doing it by themselves.
Do you see, thank you, that's helpful clarification. To the extent that you're getting, pushback, so to speak, and people are forgetting to turn the cameras on and that sort of thing, I mean, I assume that the city attorney, if they're not doing it when they should be doing it, and they're not doing it perhaps intentionally, do the deputies understand that that is a potential ground for discipline if they're not satisfying the requirements? And are you getting pushback on that?
We're not getting pushback. I think it's an adjustment for some of our staff. I wouldn't say that our staff is hesitant to utilize the cameras. We're encouraging our staff to understand the benefits of utilizing the body cameras. And the city attorney's office is absolutely sharing with them the legal requirements. We also talk to our staff about why they should do what is required of the policy, and hopefully not enter the disciplinary process by not following those rules and those guidelines. So it's something that, again, is a work in progress for the Denver Sheriff's Department.
When do you anticipate full implementation by the Sheriff's Department?
I believe the training will be done by the end of October, if I'm not mistaken. And so they're conducting the training for all uniformed staff. And here's the thing that I want to emphasize with that. Pulling deputies off the floor, pulling them out of court services or wherever they're assigned to do this training is a significant endeavor. That means that we have to backfill them with overtime. You all know we're already short-staffed. So the training sessions have been scaled so that we can ensure that all of our staff goes through that training. And so we believe that that training plan that we have is one that's successful and one that we have done in the past. So we're anticipating that I believe it's the end of October that we'll be complete with that training.
Thank you.
Any other questions on the body worn? Or we can keep moving on down the list, Sheriff. Thank you.
All right, thank you. The next two sections are somewhat correlated from the way that the questions were framed, and these are also things that I know you all talked to the Executive Director of Safety with during his last session with you, Director Soldalte. So for question 4, it is our understanding that the Criminal Investigation Unit has not received a formal delegation of authority from the Executive Director of Public Safety to perform any criminal investigations or file criminal charges. Is that correct? That has not changed since you all spoke to Director Soldalte. He shared that he had not issued that delegation. We have not received that yet. I know that there are discussions about how that delegation can be done or whether it can be done. So those are active discussions that are happening in the background. What is the current extent of the CIU's operations? The CIU is doing some preliminary limited scope of work when it comes to offenses that happen in our custody to prepare things prior to them being turned over to the Denver Police Department. They've been doing that for quite some time. Those deputies are doing the same thing that any other Denver deputy would do. It's just their work is a little more focused in helping the Denver Police Department prior to those things being handed off to them. Have deputies already been assigned to the unit? If so, how many? There are 7 deputies total that are part of the CIU and 1 sergeant, which I would like to highlight represents less than 2% of our department. There are 4 deputies that are investigators. 2 deputies are gang unit investigators, which are positions that previously existed in the Denver Sheriff's Department, but because of their work, we moved them under the Criminal Investigations Unit, and 1 intelligence analyst who analyzes information that the CIU gathers or that the gang unit investigators bring forward. Has the CIU ever arrested anyone? The CIU has not arrested anyone in the general sense that you would think about arrests, but the Denver Sheriff's Department has a fugitive warrant detail that has been in existence since before I was even a deputy 29 years ago. And the CIU deputies have gone and helped those warrant deputies to apprehend fugitives on outstanding Denver District Court criminal warrants. Has the CIU ever conducted any interviews or interrogations? The CIU does not do interrogations. We prohibit those by our policy across the board, but they perform cursory interviews with folks in preparation for DPD detectives and filing or following through with the case. So if someone is assaulted in our custody, they may ask who's the person that assaulted you, things of that nature, in writing those reports prior to the Denver Police Department picking up the case. Julia, do you want to have your question now, or would you prefer that I wait until I finish the rest of the series?
Yeah, it's just point of clarification what you just said. Can you just, I don't really know what the difference between an interrogation and an interview is. So could you just elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. An interrogation is for the general public, a session where you see someone sitting in a room and they're asking them a lot of pointed questions, versus an interview where you walk up to someone and say, can you tell me what happened? You can do an interview anywhere. An interrogation is where you would separate someone, place them in a room, and begin to ask them those questions for the purpose of finding out something related to a case. So the deputies don't do a pointed interrogation. They may just simply do an interview with folks as things happen in the jail prior to the Denver Police Department. Okay. Has the CIU ever operated outside of the jail? Once. In December of 2022, the CIU worked with the Denver Police Department's District 6 Narcotics Unit to assist with apprehending subjects who are attempting to introduce narcotics to the downtown detention center. So it was directly related to folks who were trying to get drugs into the jail. Because of that work done by the CIU and DPD's District 6 Narcotics Unit, one person has pled guilty and has received 12 years in the Colorado Department of Corrections. Another person pled guilty and received 8 years in the Colorado Department of Corrections. One person has another case that is still pending. 3 others have pled not guilty and their cases are still pending. Another person pled guilty and is awaiting sentencing. And the last question in this series is, when do you anticipate the policies governing the CIU's operations to be finalized? That is dependent on the delegation, as well as Director Soldalte and my conversations, along with the city attorney's office and perhaps the mayor's office review about what duties the Denver deputy sheriff should be doing in regards to the CIU. Stephan, let me, before I take your question, let me just add in, one of the things that we have been working towards is figuring out ways to make the Denver Sheriff's Department more attractive to folks who want to do this work. In addition, the CIU was brought forward because as the Denver Police Department has had challenges with staffing, and as police officers are called to respond to calls on the street, we have always thought that it would be a great idea if the Denver Sheriff's Department was able to handle charges that are cases that happen inside the Denver Sheriff's Department and to bring them forward for filing. That is the reason that the CIU has been brought forward as a pilot project, as an idea, and we still believe that to be true today. So Stephan, first, let me go to you, and then Julia, I'll go to you next.
Thank you, Sheriff. Yeah, my follow-up questions I understand the purpose behind, why the CIU has been created and why you want it to be more operational. I get that. My concerns are over process. And that is, so my first question is, you indicated that the CIU has been doing sort of a preliminary limited scope of work while awaiting any, getting this formal delegation of authority from the Executive Director of Public Safety. I presume, number one, that you feel, or does and I guess maybe you can't speak for him, that the Executive Director of Public Safety feels that that's okay to engage in that preliminary type of work, even though there hasn't been a formal delegation of authority. I'll let you answer that one before I go on.
I can't speak for the director. And I see in the chat that someone wants me to define what CIU stands for. It stands for Criminal Investigations Unit. When the unit was first brought forward, it was the Criminal Charges Filing Team. We changed the name of the unit to the Criminal Investigations Unit. Stephan, what I can tell you is this preliminary work is something that Denver deputies have been doing for ever. When I was a deputy, I would write reports in preparation for Denver police officers coming into the jail when we had to call them off the streets to get things ready for them to be able to take cases. The CIU is doing the same thing. So the deputies that are assigned to this unit are doing similar work to what Denver deputies have been doing for quite some time. It's just that they're in this unit as a part of their primary duties, but they're also deployed when they're not doing this work, because it doesn't happen all the time, to go back and work on the floor, to go back and do other duties that Denver deputy sheriffs do. So it's not that they're only doing this work, it's also that they're performing other functions as Denver deputy sheriffs as well. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, somewhat. I think, again, going back to process, look, I think my concern, perhaps our concern, is simply that we just want to make sure that the process is followed, that the deputies are getting the appropriate amount of training to do this, to engage in this broader spectrum of work than they usually do when they're on the floor. And that, again, it goes to, sort of writing reports, body worn cameras, how to interview people, how to interrogate people, all of that sort of thing, post-training and otherwise. We want to make sure that all of that is done, all of those boxes are checked, so that when they're engaging in this broader delegation of authority, that they're doing it appropriately. That's really the issue for me. So even though, for example, you mentioned the incident in December of 2022, yeah, I mean, look, that's appropriate, obviously appropriate. We don't want drugs coming into the jails. Of course not. But you also don't want people engaging in law enforcement activity that hasn't been properly authorized by the executive director of public safety. Again, I come back to process. Can you comment on that?
I can. Thank you, Stephan. We have the same idea when it comes to these deputies being properly trained, Stephan, which is why every single one of those deputies was sent to a post academy to become post certified as well. So in addition to the 16-week deputy sheriff academy that they have all attended prior to being part of this unit, they all have also went to a post academy and graduated from the post academy. Some of them were actually honor graduates in those post academies. So we believe that they have received the additional training that they need. And there's ongoing training that's going to happen when we receive the delegation, or should we receive the delegation. It's going to happen from other folks, such as the DA's office, such as the city attorney's office, such as DPD detectives that are doing this work. So this is not something that we're just jumping into and just throwing these deputies to the wolves to do this work without them getting the proper training. They actually have been trained to be able to do some of this work. And we're taking our time and doing this incrementally because we want to do it right. This is something that we've been looking forward to since the history of the Denver Sheriff's Department. I mean, it's been 120 years since we got to this point. So for us to take our time and to do this right and to take a few more months to ensure that we're getting it right is something that we're very mindful and thoughtful about as well.
And I assume that in that regard, you are optimistic that you will get a formal delegation of authority from the executive director of public safety when everything is appropriately in place for this unit to actually launch in any kind of official capacity.
I'm cautiously optimistic, Stephan. As the sheriff, one of the things that I have to do is remain hopeful. I'm a man of faith. In Jeremiah 29:11, the Lord talks about plans that he has to prosper us, plans to provide us a hope and a future. And in doing this as what I would consider to be my ministry, one of the things that I have to do is to always remain hopeful that things will get better for the Denver Sheriff's Department. So I'm very hopeful that that is going to be the case.
Okay. Julia, go. Yeah,
Julia.
I know Julia's questions. Go ahead.
I'm ready, Julia.
Cool. That verse brought me back to my high school church going days. So just having a bit of a flashback. What I'm sort of wondering about is, right, you've got this very tough recruiting environment, as does DPD. And I just sort of wonder, are you creating competition with your sister department in trying to hire and recruit folks that want to be doing law enforcement? So there's like the bucket of questions, which is like, are you creating a more competitive environment or out of already a tough recruiting environment? And then there's a second question, which is, are you then creating an environment, say that's not true, or it is true. Are you then creating an environment where you're actually just training folks who will then join the DPD because what they really want to be doing is law enforcement, and you've got sort of limited career options for that within your department, right? You're saying it's less than 2% of the department. So you've got, a tiny staff, limited career mobility within that sort of functional line. And then people say, well, if I want to get promoted or I want to like expand my law enforcement career, right, I go straight to the police department. So I just sort of wonder, like, if this is your unique recruiting tool, in terms of the ecosystem, is that really going to get you what you need?
Very good question, Julia. And I've been asked about this from other folks as well. We don't believe that we're recruiting against the Denver Police Department. I think there is enough work for the Denver Police Department to do in the city and county of Denver, and their work is actually growing. I think this is us taking on the work that we can do. And we're starting small because we want to make sure that we're doing it right. It is a very small pool of our current staff, but perhaps going forward into the future, it could grow and become something where we have additional staff that are assigned to this. It also joins in with the other idea that we have about the bike patrol, which we're going to be talking about in just a moment, and other ideas that we have about how we can help with additional public safety duties in the city and county of Denver. These are all thoughts. These are all dreams, hopes that we have as a department, that I have as the sheriff, about how do we attract folks to come to do this work. It's not like it was 30 years ago where folks only want to work in a pod. The generation that we're hiring now, they want to have a diverse career. And it also helps as you do this work for 30, 35 years to be able to have those various opportunities. So as we begin to implement these things incrementally with small units, perhaps one day they're going to grow, which will help us to be able to assign deputies to do different things because those units become bigger than they are now. Perhaps we have different opportunities to do different things. So we have other ideas that we're talking about in the background. I won't talk about those today, but I believe that there's enough work for the Denver Police Department to recruit the good folks, the great folks that do that work. And there's enough work for the Denver Sheriff Department to hire great people to come work beside us to do the work that we do as well. All right, there was one more question in this series that I did not answer. Oh, Karen, I saw your hand go up.
Okay, thank you and good morning.
Good morning.
Until you go through several cycles of classes of candidates coming on board, how does the implementation of the CIU not add to overtime for the existing personnel?
Well, with the very small number of deputies that we have that are doing it, it is their primary responsibility, but that work isn't so exhaustive that they can be reassigned to floor duties to take care of those and then break away when they need to do the CIU work. So we don't believe that the less than 2% of our department that is assigned to the unit is causing significant hours of overtime. It's a very small group of deputies that are doing this work.
Thank you.
Julia.
Yeah, so just kind of one more follow-up question on the morale, right? So what you're saying is you're hearing from folks, they want different career opportunities. We've heard, and I think in, like a 2015 report, Hillard Hines report suggested that, this is often cited as a desire from the department. You mentioned 120 years, and in part because it's, there's this like internal perception or internal morale issue about, the prestige of the DPD versus the prestige of the DSD. And so I wonder if you feel like that's true. If there are other things to do from a morale standpoint that sort of bring that prestige, help create a sense of importance and value in the team, right? That's sort of, I know you're working on other things, but like, if this is supposed to solve that problem, or if this is one tool, it's only going to serve a few percentage, staff members. So I just sort of wonder about the overall value to effort on that. And if you could speak to that, it'd be helpful.
Absolutely. I think what it does is it gives our staff a belief that things are going to get better and things that we can do, as a law enforcement agency, are going to be supported. I think this helps us to say that the door is open for us to begin to do other things. And we want to do it right, and we can explain to our staff that we're starting off small, but perhaps one day this is going to grow. Perhaps the other things that we have in place are going to be brought forward, and that they're going to come to fruition. So I think from a broader perspective, we do have morale issues, and some of that has to do with the perception that folks have externally from this agency. What I would ask all of you, what I would ask the public, what I would ask anyone who talks about the Denver Sheriff's Department to do is to laud the good work that we're doing and to stand next to us, to help us as we want to do these things as we go forward, to be supportive and to understand how when we take steps backwards or when we constantly are being scrutinized and folks aren't looking at the good work that we're doing, how that diminishes the good profile that the Denver Sheriff's Department has been working towards the past couple of years. We've done a lot to be out in the community to demonstrate how we are public servants, how we love the work that we do, how we love this agency and the people that we serve, and that we can be the agency that we want to be. And so I think that has helped us to improve morale along with some of the things that we're doing inside of our agency. So we look forward to continuing to move the Denver Sheriff's Department in the right direction. Stefan, I see you have a question.
I just want to respond to that from my personal perspective. What deputies do is an extremely difficult job. I also understand exactly what you're saying in terms of for retention purposes, for recruiting purposes, you want to have the ability to, expand the scope of responsibilities of deputy sheriffs. I personally get all that. I'm not speaking for the entire board, but I think, and in terms of providing support though, Sheriff, I think it's important to know that with something like this, with a CIU unit where you haven't gotten the formal delegation of authority, and then the public and/or we become aware of the fact that perhaps things have been done, perhaps activities have taken place without that formal delegation of authority, I think that can set the Sheriff's Department back. Because what it then appears that the Sheriff's Department doing something that they haven't gotten the formal delegation of authority for yet. Again, setting aside the laudable purpose of it. So I'm just, again, for the third time, I guess, saying just following the process and just making sure that things aren't put into action and operation until they're formally approved by the executive director. That's my overriding point, which I've now made probably 3 times. So I apologize for the repetitiveness.
Stefan, let me also, and thank you for the question. Let me also clarify. The delegation gives the deputies the ability to file charges. That's what the delegation is about. It's not about the deputies gathering information, because deputies gather information constantly. We have report writing. We have to teach our deputies the who, what, why, where, and when. Who, what, why, where, and when to put into their reports. So this work that the deputies that are assigned to the CIU is doing is not very different than what we do as deputy sheriffs. The ability for those deputies to not have to call a police officer off the street to file those charges is what the delegation is about. So it's not putting those deputies into the unit. So thank you for the question, because it helps me to be able to clarify that for the public and for the board as well. We appreciate that you all are helping to represent the community's interest in the work that we're doing. And we look forward to the moment when we do get that delegation and those deputies are able to do that good work, and we're able to move forward as a department with going full steam ahead with the Criminal Investigations Unit, otherwise known as the CIU.
Thank you for that clarification.
Absolutely. There was one additional question that I didn't get to. Go ahead, Karen.
Sheriff Diggins, I want to say that the public's concern and the news reports that come out about instances, particularly about loss of life happening in the confines of the detention facilities somewhat overshadow the work that you do on a daily basis, which is laudable. And so it's difficult to have a balance and to put the emphasis on the lack of morale due to the lack of feedback and input about the good work that you do, when we periodically have instances of loss of life in detention facilities.
Karen, I get that as a member of the community, growing up here, being from Montbello, getting calls from the families who, some of them I know personally, when it comes to that loss of life. It hurts me, it hurts us as a department, and it's always a tragedy when that occurs. And we feel for those families when those things occur. We appreciate the fact that folks also understand how difficult the work can be and the good work that's being done by the department. So it's a very, this work is not easy for any of us, right? It's a tough place to be, but we're committed to it. It's our calling. It's the Denver Sheriff's Department members' calling to do this good work and to hopefully have folks go back to the community better than how they came to us.
Thank you.
All right.
Sheriff, I wanted to actually maybe even use that last comment of yours to sort of try to articulate this question, so bear with me. When we're talking about the criminal investigations unit, right, we have this unit that could potentially have a delegation to file charges like you're talking about. And I just wonder if you could speak to, what I guess personally think of as the sheriff's sort of mandate to keep the jail safe, keep the community safe, but then like you mentioned, like leave people in a better place than when they came back. And so there's this rehabilitation aspect to everything where sheriffs who are not filing charges, right, not coming to court potentially to testify against those people stuck in custody that they, are taken care of. They just seems to be, the criminal justice system is so adversarial in nature versus, in the jail, the sheriffs have this unique opportunity to have an interaction with somebody who's law enforcement, but is there in a rehabilitative way. So I'm just thinking of this in terms of, having a criminal investigations unit that is, looking for crime, investigating, sort of like watching and trying to catch things versus sheriffs who are there just to have a relationship with people in the pod that they're watching to sort of understand who's struggling with mental health issues or maybe having substance abuse issues or knows that housing stability is going to be a roadblock for that person as they get closer to whatever their end date is. And so there's just, I wonder if you could just sort of speak to, the sheriffs being sort of that very unique interaction with law enforcement where the job is, like you said, very tough. And we got to keep the court safe. We got to keep the jail safe. We got to keep your people safe. And then the people who are stuck in custody safe versus like, investigating and like doing this sort of like proactive. Because when I think of in criminal investigations, and I think of the Denver Police Department, I think of, self-initiated stops, police officers stopping people to, sort of make contact, and it's not always in a friendly way. So I wonder if you could sort of speak to how the CIU sort of falls in that mix, if that question and rambling makes any sense.
Yeah, it made sense, Nick. We wear many hats. And in working with the folks that are in custody, one of the things that our deputies do is become mentors sometimes to folks that are in custody, or they encourage them to take classes, or they help them along with our civilian staff who do a phenomenal job with making those connections back to the community. What you'll find is that the investigators for the criminal investigations unit would be separate and apart from those deputies that are working in the pod, in the sense that if someone assaults another person while they're in custody, it would not be the deputy who's working in the pod or the deputy that's responding that would be the investigator that would move those charges forward. It would be someone who would be exterior to that situation that would come in to do that. So it would be similar to us, instead of calling a police officer off the street to file those charges, it would be one of the deputies in the CIU. So those deputies that are working in the pods that are doing that work every day would not be the same deputies that are working in the CIU. If one of those CIU deputies happens to be in a pod or happens to be someplace where they see something occur or they're a responder, they would not be able to investigate or bring those charges forward. It would be separate and apart from the work that they do. So it is a lot of work that has to be done, and we do continue to hopefully help folks as they transition back to the community. We have a lot of good work that's going on. Hopefully I can talk about some of that here in just a moment. But Nick, did that answer your question?
Yes, I appreciate you speaking to that point. Thank you.
Okay. Absolutely. All right, now I'm going to get to the last question in that series, which is the draft CIU policy mentions the practice of show-ups for identification purposes. Are you familiar with the Denver community's prior interactions with the Denver Police Department about show-ups? Yes, I am. As a member of the Denver Sheriff's Department and as someone who grew up in this area, I am very familiar with the community's prior interactions, concerns about show-ups. The policy that we have mirrors the Denver Police Department's policy when it comes to that specific section of the CIU's operation. So I'll pause there.
Yes, does anyone have follow-up questions just on sort of this batch of questions? Otherwise, we can move on to, I think next we're talking about the bike patrol unit.
Okay. The bike patrol unit. Has the bike patrol unit received a delegation of authority from the Executive Director of Public Safety to conduct enforcement actions? Do you believe that such a delegation of authority is required for the bike patrol unit? The first part of that is there has been no delegation from the director, as he stated in his last meeting with you all. And the fact of the matter, whether or not a delegation is required, is something that has to be answered by the city attorney's office. Is the bike patrol unit currently operation? No, it is not. Question number 9, the bike patrol unit policy states that they can self-initiate stops. What does this mean? So I want to point you all, as well as the public, to our public-facing website, which has a number of our policies and procedures. We have Department Order 1.00.5003, which is exercise of authority as a peace officer to stop or arrest suspects. The authority for Denver Sheriff employees, for Denver Sheriff Department deputy ranks to stop people has been in existence since at least 2008. I went back and looked at my archives. I have the distinction of being a part of those conversations when they were started by Manager of Safety Al LeCade many years ago, who some of you know. And our department order relative to our authority was changed at that time. And so we have had the authorization from the Director of Safety's office to stop or arrest suspects in very specific ways. Additionally, Colorado Revised Statute 16-3-103 talks about stopping of a suspect and states a peace officer may stop a person who he reasonably believes suspect is committing, has committed, or is about to commit a crime, and then it goes on from there. So the authority for Denver deputies to be able to stop people is something that we have already had in our policy. Yeah, that department order also specifically calls out, in exercising the authority granted by this order, Denver deputy sheriffs shall not engage in the following activities: general patrol duties, the stopping or pursuit of any moving vehicle, the use of any department vehicle or other vehicle to actively chase or pursue a person or a vehicle, and the enforcement of laws relating only to a traffic offense. So I'll stop there. Julia, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, just interested in the geographic or physical boundaries that somebody can conduct that arrest. Is that like, sheriff's deputy is like at a dinner, at a restaurant with their family anywhere, and then they see something happen and they can, conduct an arrest? Or is that like, on the boundaries of the jail? Or talk a little bit about like where?
Yeah, not if you're at dinner with your family. When you're off duty and out of uniform, you are not authorized to take those actions. So if you're in uniform within the boundaries of the city and county of Denver, we have very specific times when that can occur. Generally, it's during exigent circumstances. So if we see someone who is assaulting someone, who is actively assaulting someone, or someone said that person right there just punched me in the face, the Denver deputy sheriff is able to go and stop that person and then can call the Denver Police Department to begin to file charges. The question way back in 2008 was, what is the definition between a detainment and a stop and arrest? And it was this significant legal discussion that happened with the Denver Sheriff's Department, the Director of Safety's office, the City Attorney's office, and the like. That was the reason that the department order was changed, so that when a crime occurs and someone is standing in uniform, the public has an expectation that a Denver deputy sheriff is going to act to assist or to help that person. And so that is how we have trained our deputies. That is the action that we do and that we're called to do as well. Does that answer your question, Julia?
Yeah, it does. So I'm just trying to think of like, what would a circumstance, is it just passive? Like I'm driving to work, I'm in my uniform, I stop at, Dutch Brothers for coffee, I see a crime, I engage, or like I don't know, like wandering around, like how does that happen? I just am trying to imagine. Or you're escorting inmates to the county jail, and you see someone using heroin on the street, or sort of like, can you give a couple of scenarios of when that would sort of play out, or how?
Not when you're driving on your way to work and you see something happen at a Dutch Brothers, you would call 911 and be a good witness. If you are on duty and you see something occur and you're outside in the plaza of the LFC or outside the city and county building, something along those lines, then you would act. That's absolutely something that a deputy will be covered under our policy and acting under circumstances. So there are very specific situations that our staff is trained on and the exercise of that authority, and they're spelled out in that department order as well.
Okay, great. So it sounds to me like sort of a passive bystander who is deputized to make an arrest in the case of a crime, but not, we're not having deputies go to the courthouse and then, set up a patrol or, have a post or something like that. That's not what we're doing here, or is it?
We have deputies that are working in the courthouse, in the city and county building, and the Lindsay Flanagan courthouse that walk the hallways to ensure that the peace is kept. That is a part of our duties. In fact, that position is called hall patrol. That has been in existence since I was a sergeant 20 years ago. So we do have deputies that are posted in different places, that's their responsibility to make sure that if something happens, that we have staff that are readily available to respond to the situation. Okay. All right, I'll move on to the next question. Number 10, will members of the bike patrol unit carry firearms? All uniformed deputy sheriffs carry firearms and only disarm when we go into the secure perimeter of the jails, which means any area where perhaps somebody in custody is. But outside of that, we all carry firearms. I have one on right now. Julia, I don't know, your hand is still up. Is that a still hand? Okay. Number 10, how many deputies have been or will be assigned to the bike patrol unit? Again, this is something that we're still discussing. The policy has not been finalized. I pulled it down so that Director Saldalte and I can have some additional discussions and also bring the mayor's office into this discussion. But we have trained 1 sergeant and 3 deputies to be a part of the bike patrol unit, which represents 0.5% of our uniform staff. And will the bike patrol unit be limited to operating on the city block, including the DDC and the courthouse? Again, that is to be determined after those discussions with the Director of Safety, the mayor's office, and myself, and the city attorney as well. So I'll pause there, as that is the end of that series of questions.
I guess I just had a quick question following up on that in terms of sort of the geographical boundaries and that's still being worked out. Is your anticipation or maybe hope that it would include like the Lindsay Flanagan Courthouse, the Van Cise Detention Center, but then are you also looking to the city and county building? Because then we're at Civic Center Park, and I'm just wondering if there's like potential for overlap, because I know State Patrol has the Capitol and it's all right next to each other. So I wonder if you could just speak to that.
Yeah, Nick, the initial thought that we had when we began to talk about this was the area that you talked about from, I believe it's Fox Street, which is the backside of the Lindsay Flanagan Courthouse, through the plaza between the LFC and the downtown detention center, through to the city and county building, because those are areas that the Denver Sheriff's Department currently is responsible for security, because we have security responsibilities inside of those buildings as well. So this, in my mind, was an additional tool that our staff could utilize when they're already performing some of these exterior functions, to be able to utilize those bikes to be able to do that as well. Terrence, good morning to you.
Good morning. So you've said a lot about the city attorney's office, the mayor's office, executive director of safety being involved in these discussions. What about the police department? Has Chief Thomas weighed in? What's their position on the expansion of some of the authority? I don't want to say authority, but expansion of the duties of the deputies.
Chief Thomas has been involved in some of the discussions related to the criminal investigations unit. This actually started when Chief Payson was still the chief of police, and so he was in the room for some of those discussions. Chief Thomas and his team have helped the criminal investigations unit to prepare, if the delegation is given, to be able to work through some of the logistics when it comes to the system that's needed to file charges as well. So Chief Thomas is aware. I'm not sure if Chief Thomas and I have had any specific discussions about the bike patrol unit, but there are members of the Denver Police Department command staff that have had discussions with the Denver Sheriff's Department command staff about some of these things. And again, this is still a work in progress. So we're going to make sure that we touch base with all of these folks and ensure that if there's any overlap or responsibility that may be done in the same space, that we work together. We work with DPD every day, every single day. The Denver Police Department, the Denver Sheriff's Department works together. So I don't anticipate that there would be a time where something like this would not be something that we would be able to work through. And I would say, in fact, the relationship between the Denver Sheriff's Department and the Denver Police Department is the best that I have seen in the past 29 years today. And it's because we have been very proactive about doing that, about making sure that we all work together, sometimes in the same space. Did that answer your question, Terrence? Okay, thank you. All right, seeing no more questions, I'll move on to the next series, which is Career Service Authority Discipline Appeals. Question 13. Are you familiar with the Career Service Authority process that deputies have used to appeal and overturn written reprimands, distinct from appealing to the Career Service Board? Yes, I am. I'm very familiar with it. Is this appeal process documented in DSD policy? It is documented in Career Service Rule 18 dispute resolution, which all Denver deputies are subject to. So in addition to the department orders that we have, we're also subject to all Career Service Authority rules, unless there is a specific section which provides an exception to Denver deputy sheriffs, such as in the pay classifications, because we have a collective bargaining agreement. If not, how are deputies made aware of it? So when a deputy is issued a written reprimand, and for the public's information, what we're talking about is the sheriff has the authority and the ability to issue written reprimands to employees of the Denver Sheriff's Department, including all deputy sheriff ranks. When a deputy is given, or a uniform staff member is given a written reprimand, included in that reprimand is language directly from the Career Service Authority, which states you may initiate a grievance of this written reprimand and or seek mediation in accordance with Career Service Rule 18 dispute resolution. If you request mediation, be advised that this action does not suspend the time limit for filing a grievance. In the Career Service Rule, Rule 1830, which talks about grievance procedure, it gives specific instructions to our staff about filing a grievance, but also to us as leaders and responding to that grievance as well. The next question states, are all deputies made aware of it and able to utilize it equally? Yes, they are, because every single time that written reprimand is issued, that language is included in that reprimand. The last question in this series is the OIM was never informed when these appeals took place or when discipline was overturned. Why were they excluded from this process? I'm not sure why the OIM was excluded from this process, but what I can tell you is that historically, written reprimands were able to be issued by my predecessors. They were able to be issued by Interim Sheriff Frank Gomez, Sheriff Patrick Furman, Sheriff Gary Wilson, Director of Corrections Bill Lovinger. So this goes back many, many, many years about the process. And I don't believe that the monitor's office, and Greg, you've been around for all of those folks, I don't believe that the monitor's office was included in the written reprimand grievance process. But what I will say is I am absolutely open to talking to the monitor and the Director of Safety's office about how we change that going forward. So I look forward to that discussion, and we'll pause there for additional questions. Stephan? Oh, you're still on mute.
I sure am. Thank you. To state pretty much the obvious on that, Sheriff, it's about transparency. It's about, communication. I mean, the OIM and the COB are, have roles to fill in terms of oversight. And when discipline is overturned without knowledge, and it's done, purportedly done, in secret without us knowing about it, even if that wasn't intentional, that doesn't create it creates a lack of trust and a lack of transparency. So we certainly would welcome, if the OIM was under the impression that the written reprimand were stood in, let's say, I'm picking a number here, 30 or 40 cases, and then they learn after the fact that they were reversed, that doesn't exactly, enhance the goal of transparency. So we very much would like the OIM involved in this process so that they're knowledgeable about when these situations occur.
I appreciate that, Stephan, and I certainly can understand that perspective. I would say that it's not done in secret. It's a record that is recorded through numerous means inside of systems inside of the city and county of Denver. What I would say is this is a miss that has been in place for over a decade. And I think if we find something that has been amiss, if we find something that needs to be changed, we as leaders say, absolutely, let's talk about it. Let's figure out how to get this done. I am absolutely open to the conversation. We'd love to talk to Liz Castle and Director Soldalte about how we change that going forward.
Okay, appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure. Any additional questions? Okay. Let's see where we are. Okay, these are the time permitting questions, so we're moving through pretty quickly. And Nick, I'm not sure how much time do we have?
I think if we there's only a few of these, so maybe we'll just try to get through these. I know that and then we'll check in with Ms. Castle and see if there's anything to do in executive session. Thank you.
Okay, sounds good. Has the Denver Sheriff's Department hired a medical administrator to work with Denver Health? I'm happy to report that we have done interviews. We have one candidate that has gone forward for consideration, but we're going to have to interview one more person per Career Service Authority rules. We have to interview at least 3 people to be considered before we move forward with those interviews. But we had a very, very good interview with one of the candidates and look forward to the next interview as well. So there is a member of your panel of your board who was a part of that, and I'm going to be reaching out to that person to ask them to again be a part of that process. I value the input of the COB, and that was the reason that I asked that person to be a part of this, because I know that this is something that you all take to heart. Any questions on that before I move forward? Okay. Do you have data on the extent of inmates' use of the new tablets? Yes, we do. The last time we spoke, you mentioned that inmates were making significantly more phone calls. Has that trend continued? Yes, it absolutely has. We believe that the tablets have absolutely increased the ability for the people that are in custody to stay in contact with their families. Specifically, I can tell you that from March 12th to April 1st of this year, there were 27,000 calls made at the DDC. The following month, there were 33,000 calls made. In May, there were 47,000 calls made. And in June, there were 41,000 calls made just at the DDC. At the county jail, from March 12th to April 1st, there were 12,000 calls made. From April 2nd to April 30th, 19,000 calls made. From May 1st to May 30th, 18,000 calls. And from June 1st to June 30th, 20,000 calls. So we receive a report from our partner for phones every quarter. And so I'm very pleased to share that data with you all. Are there any questions on that before I move forward? Okay, the last question, could you provide an update on the food service provider transition? Is the new provider operating at the levels expected? Have there been any unanticipated challenges? Yes, I can provide an update. I have spoken to not just the major, but also the regional director about how things are going. They tell me that they're going fairly well. There have been a few changes and challenges that they've had to overcome, but the quality of food is something that has improved since our last vendor was on site. And the quality of food for our staff, which is also part and parcel to morale, has improved tremendously as well. So I think the change that we made has been one which has been in the best interest of the people in custody as well as our staff. So I'll pause there for any questions. Okay, seeing none. That is the last question in our series, and certainly would like to answer anything else that you all may have.
Thank you, Sheriff. So I guess we can see if there's any questions that people want to drop into the Q&A, or if any of the board members have any other issues they'd like to ask Sheriff Diggins about.
Julie?
I'm not seeing any. Thank you, Sheriff Diggins,
Oh,
for.
I just raised my hand.
I'm sorry.
I just was going to say congrats, Sheriff, on raising the food quality. Obviously, that is necessary for life, and to have that be better than it was is a good direction. So thanks for making the change there, and yeah, just good job.
Well, we appreciate it. It's definitely a team effort.
Okay, well, without any other community questions, I think we can close it out with Sheriff Diggins. Thank you for joining us, and obviously you're welcome to stay on the call with us. I guess the next is there any other board business that we want to talk about in the open forum?
I'm actually going to jump off, Nick.
Okay.
I got to go and take a bite out of crime. So
Thank you for joining us.
everyone have a good weekend.
Okay, and then Liz Castle, anything that you wanted to discuss in the public session?
Thank you.
Okay, and then was there anything to discuss in executive session?
We'd like a brief conversation.
Okay, so then if we could have a motion to move to executive session.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, so we will hop off that and the call, and then just to remind the public, our next meeting is September 15th, and the links for that will be available on the website. So we will transition to executive session. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.